I'm Aimee Runyan, author of Girls on the Line, and this is Author's Voice.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world. This is Lit with Love, and I am Sonali Dev, your host. Thank you so much for being here. We have with us today the very lovely Aimee Runyan. Hi Aimee.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. So we're going to be discussing Aimee's book, Girls on the Line. Aimee's fabulous book, Girls on the Line, which is a novel set in World War One, in this, I think, completely ignored piece of history, because Ruby, the protagonist, is an operator with the Army Signal Corps, which was run mostly by women in World War One, and it's an amazing piece of history, and we're going to be talking about it. It is published by Lake Union and is only $14.95. So please be sure to order a signed copy from authorsvoice.net. Aimee will sign it for you. Also, thank you, Lake Union, for publishing this beautiful book and sending us Aimee. And if you're watching this on Facebook Live, as you know, you can ask questions live in the comments. And if you're watching it on our website, authorsvoice.net, you can use the button to ask questions there as well. If you are watching this on YouTube after the show, you can still purchase a signed copy. Do you want to start us out by telling us a little bit about the book?
Sure.
And then we'll jump into our discussion.
Well, Girls on the Line is the story of Ruby Wagner. She is a woman who grew up in kind of an upwardly mobile family in Philadelphia, in the Mainline district, which is a really posh district in the Philadelphia area. And of course, America was kind of late to start in World War I, but once America joined the war in 1917, everybody was very keen to join up in the war, especially the young men. And so she essentially is helping the war effort at home by working as a telephone operator. She certainly didn't need to work, and her family wasn't necessarily enamored with the idea of her having a job. But some family friends were able to persuade her parents to say she's got this beautiful speaking voice, because she'd had elocution lessons from the time she was, a young girl, in order to speak like an upper class kind of citizen, because that's what her mother really wanted for her. And so she was working as a telephone operator, essentially as a means to help with the war effort. And when U.S. Army Signal Corps General Pershing knew that the telephone was cutting edge technology at the time, and it had been around since the 1850s, but it really became, the infrastructure was in place to actually be able to use it on a wide scale at, around the World War I era. And so she gets sent over because they were looking for women to run the phone system, because they realized, of course, they started by having the men who were actually already enlisted in the U.S. Army Signal Corps doing the job, but a woman could place 5 calls in the time it took a man to place 1, because we are just better natural multitaskers. And that's kind of an ongoing joke in the book, is that, the women, like, we've got to be able to do the ironing, keep the kids from falling off a balcony, and, make dinner all at the same time. So that's why they were better at being able to do that. And so she ends up signing up after a family tragedy. And it's kind of the story of her growth as a person and her experience going through the horrors that she saw in World War I.
Yeah, I mean, I think a love story against the backdrop of war. It's certainly my jam, and I think how can you go wrong with that? Almost,
Exactly.
Right? There's just such beauty, and we all read, for whatever that element of truth about being human is, and wartime is just a time when that humanity comes to the surface so much.
Absolutely.
And so it's such a great setting for a love story. Of course, this is you know, me being who I am, I seek out love stories in books, and it is just beautiful. But overall, it's a beautiful book. It's almost like being there.
Oh,
so,
thank
so
you.
we're going to talk a lot about research today, Aimee, because you really did. I mean, the authenticity in the details is quite amazing.
Oh, thank you.
But before we get into that, I feel like, I had no idea. I had no idea about, even the history of the telephone itself, but I had no idea about the involvement of women in the First World War, other than nurses. And so it just feels like such a lost piece of history. So why this story, and where did that come from?
Well, it's interesting is that a friend of mine who was kind of one of the first people that I met through a professional organization, Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers, who had kind of encouraged me in the first days of my first novel. He sent me an article about the Hello Girls, because we've come up to the 100th anniversary of the end of the war, and he sent me an article about the Hello Girls, which was the nickname for the women who were telephone operators. And that was a nickname for telephone operators in general from the turn of the century up until the 1950s. And he said, this is what you do. You need to write this book. And I'm like, well, you were in the U.S. Army Signal Corps. And he's like, but this is this is kind of a story that needs to be told from a woman's point of view. And I said, well, you're right. And then I started doing the research, and it was just one of those stories where I'm like, yeah, this has to be told, because it is something that we don't learn about in our average history books. We focus so much. I mean, World War I, from especially from an American point of view, is very different if you study history in Canada or the UK. World War I is a big focus in history curriculum there. In here, it's kind of like this interesting blip between the Civil War and World War II, which were more important to the American psyche than World War I, but just the kind of the historical importance of women in World War I is something that is incredibly understated in our American history curriculums, and that is part of the reason. That's kind of what I do, celebrating history's unsung heroines. And so that's, I was sent that article, and then I started doing just a bit more research, and Ruby kind of leapt up off the pages of the research, and I had to tell her story.
Now is Ruby based on a real person?
Sort of. Her timeline certainly follows the trajectory of Grace Banker, who was the chief operator of the first telephone group. 6 telephone groups were formed, and they were sent over staggered throughout the war. And the first group went over in March, and they were the pioneers. And conveniently, Grace also kept an amazing journal, even though she wasn't supposed to, and she was a naughty girl, and I love that about her. But she kept a really detailed journal, as did Bertha Hunt. And so kind of some of the anecdotes that they talk about, I was able to pull from, and some of her personality. So I took a little bit from Grace, a very tiny bit from Bertha, and some of the other women that, the letters and things that I was able to access. But then a lot of it is just kind of a healthy dose of my own imagination in addition to those, because I kind of felt like I didn't want to tell just one story of theirs. I kind of wanted to create a character who is an amalgamation of a lot of the different characters. And none of the women who were sent over actually came from Philadelphia, I don't believe. And so that was kind of a conscious choice. Like, I could have sent them from Boston or New York City, where there were plenty. But I wanted her to be sort of unique from that point of view. So.
And there is something very unique about Philadelphia society, as you tell it. And I'm going to stop for just 1 minute, because I think we had some mic trouble when we first started.
Okay.
So I think that our audience missed the introduction.
Okay.
So I'm going to do this a little bit backward and go back and introduce you and introduce ourselves one more time. So hi everyone. Sorry to do this a little bit backward. I'm Sonali Dev, your host, and you're watching Author's Voice, where we connect authors with the world. And this is Lit with Love, where we connect you specifically with romance authors and women's fiction authors. And our guest today is the lovely Aimee Runyan, who's already been talking to us about her book, Girls on the Line, which is a World War I set historical. And it is actually set in this almost lost little piece of history where the the protagonist is a female operator or a woman operator in the Army Signal Corps, and it's a war set love story, but it is also, I think, a story of the beginnings of feminism.
Absolutely.
So much, there's so much here, and we're going to be discussing it today. The book is 1495 from Lake Union, and Aimee will be signing books for you, so please order a signed copy. You can ask us questions in the comments if you're watching this on Facebook Live. If you're watching it after the show, you can still order from authorsvoice.net. So thank you so much for being here, and we'll get back into the interview. Thanks, Aimee, for being here.
No problem.
So Aimee and I were talking about where Ruby came from, and specifically why she picked this story to tell. Because Aimee tells stories of almost like lost historical stories in women's history, which are very important. And so thank you so much for doing that. All right, so we were talking about if Aimee is Ruby. Aimee is based on a real person, if Ruby is based on a real person. And about Philadelphia society and why you picked that particular place to set this in.
Well, and Philadelphia, the more, because I've only honestly visited Philadelphia once in my life, and it's an amazing city. It's an amazing city. But from the perspective, I mean, it was in between New York and Washington, D.C., so it was a major thoroughfare, obviously. And the mainline society, there was a wonderful quote from Samuel Clemens. He said, in New York, they ask what a man's worth. In Boston, they ask what a man knows. In Philadelphia, they ask who a man's father is or who his parents are. And it's kind of the truth about you couldn't just be, you couldn't make a fortune in, you know, a lot, because that was one of the neat things about the turn of the century. A lot of these amazing industries were coming and people could make a killing in these new technologies. And you couldn't just make $1 zillion and be accepted by Philadelphia society. You just couldn't. And that was a lot of the struggle behind Ruby's relationship with her mother. And her mother wanted so much for her to be a society wife. And World War I is just fascinating from the period, from the point of view that you really see the birth of major technologies and you see the death of the class system. And so, you know, just kind of that struggle between the values of the old world and the new. And Philadelphia, in particular, is one of the only cities at the time in 1917 that had 2 different telephone companies. And so it was an area where telephone operators would have definitely been in demand, and where it would have been plausible for a girl of comfortable birth, or, you know, at least comfortable circumstances. You know, her family sort of came into money when she was in her, you know, like 10, 11 years old. So she wasn't born into, you know, rags. She wasn't born into riches for certain, but she wasn't poor either. But her family was really trying to get a foothold into the society, and so there, you know, there's just a wonderful tension between her mother's values and her own. And that was really fun to work with.
And really complex. And it's amazing that you said that thing about they ask who your father is. Because one of the things when I was reading about her parents, who I think got very well done, was that there was this relatable thing for me personally. And I think growing up in India, in Indian society, there is this whole thing about what family you come from. And there is actually the line, you know, a boy from a good family and a girl from a good family kind of thing, which you don't read in a lot of Western fiction, which is very common in, you know, in the Eastern cultures, because the family you come from is, you know, is you essentially in so many ways. And so that was something that I completely personally, you know, felt a connection with. But also specifically her parents, where there is this tension of them being traditional, because this is a time in world history that the world literally flipped, like it changed, right, completely. The world as we know it today came from, you know, the colonized, period of colonization and the British Empire, and it almost went from the world where England was the major influence to when America became the major influence, and it was almost a flip between tradition and progressiveness.
Absolutely.
And so that's really interesting. But the parents themselves, while they are traditional, they really are not. I mean,
Yeah, I
as
can see
people,
it.
they're progressive. So while they have to wear this garb of tradition, their souls are progressive, right? Her dad always, her dad and her mom both want her to be a certain something, but are completely okay in a way at a very deep level with her being who she is.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that is, that was very relatable to me. Again, for the world you live in, and how you actually move out of it is when, when those you're connected with are actually on your wavelength. And parents who really are progressive will be okay with the children's dreams, even as they're trying to say they're not okay. And
Exactly.
That's just a beautifully walked line.
Well, and her father in particular, I mean, he's in a really progressive industry. I mean, he's working in radio, which was absolutely cutting edge technology. And so he was around kind of a lot of the great minds of industry in Philadelphia. And so he would have been exposed to a lot of different ideas. And he was much more open to, for example, Ruby attending college than her mother was.
Yeah, and I love how everybody works each other and works within each other. So you kind of, and this is almost a very Indian family thing. You keep, you keep your family happy, but you do what you want to do, and you kind of are constantly walking that line of taking care of people, but also coming into your own.
Absolutely.
And for sure, Ruby does that, and you can see that in actually the personalities of both Ruby and her brother, who, by the way, coming to Francis, is. I think is such a, it's almost genius in how you do him, so to speak, because when you introduce him to us, there's just a few lines. I mean, literally, I think in half a paragraph, we feel like we know this boy really, really well, and the tragedy. It happens pretty early, so I guess
it's kind of it's the inciting incident,
right? So
yeah.
So they lose him. And this young man who we feel so connected to, in so few words, is the loss of him is a tragedy you feel through the book.
The specter of Francis, it really coats every chapter.
Everything.
And I remember when I was doing an outline, I know this is a bit of, how the sausage is made,
And that's that was going to be my question. I mean, in terms of secondary characters, there's such a large and important, intricate, well-developed cast. So I was going to ask you process.
Yeah, and so when I would kind of do my outline as I was working and make sure I, just for the sake of continuity, making sure I listed all the characters who appeared in a chapter, the number of chapters where I considered Francis to be present was most of them, because his presence is felt. I mean, it's almost as though he and Ruby were twins in a respect.
Were they?
No, he was they were probably 20 months apart, I'm guessing, and he was the older brother by a small margin. But he was always her ally in the house, and she keenly felt the loss of that allyship when he went off to war, and then even more so, obviously, when he passed away.
Right, and in terms of story, to feel the pain of war is really what you have to carry through all of this as a reader. I mean, there were several times when I teared up through the book, and it's painful without being without being wrenching to a point where it's too much or it's a lot. But you carry that pain of war through. And I think one of the reasons you carry that pain of war is because this loss is so irreversible. And you show us, because of the relationship he was in and his relationship with his sister and his parents and this wonderfully progressive man in that day and age, just the kind of person you think we all know the world needed, and his loss is so irreversible in Ruby's life and in Evangeline's life and in all of that. It's just it's lovely. So yes, I think he is omnipresent in the book, and he helps. He is the soul of the book almost.
He is. He really is, and he's a lot of Ruby's driving force, like why she does what she does, and that was really the impetus for why she decided to sign up, because there were hundreds of women that wanted to go over and serve as operators overseas, and they would have been just fine without her, but she felt like she couldn't just sit home and knit socks for the Red Cross. It wasn't enough for her. It wasn't enough to connect the grocer to his client over the telephone, working at the Bell Central office. And a lot of women would have said, this is enough. What I'm doing at home is enough. And it wasn't enough for her because he really was the other part of her.
Yeah, yeah, and she's yeah. So I mean, she is already kind of raised in that whole feminine power kind of thing, because her mother is a very powerful.
Oh,
kind
she
of
absolutely is.
Yeah.
She is the power behind the entire family.
Yeah.
Her father would have never become amounted to what he did without the mother's driving force.
Right, and she would not. I love how you say she may not own it. Like she would not own it.
No, absolutely no. And I mean, I think that's part of the reason. I mean, I will not dismiss. I think women have been deliberately written out of history in many cases, and this being one of them, because we focus on the contributions of men. But when Ruby comes back, there's kind of this, well, we're not going to throw a party for you. Let's let the boy, let's recognize what the boys have done. I mean, you weren't actually in the trenches with a bayonet. No, she was about, a half mile away with her barracks burning down and,
and
literally like tromping,
and,
literally tromping through the mud trying to save the telephone equipment so that they would not lose connection with the front lines, right before the armistice, and the tragedies that could have ensued if they had lost an operating board. And she was really a strong woman from that perspective, because she learned it from her mother. She really learned it from her mother.
Absolutely. And I think it is the story of us all almost, as women, and our progress. That is the story, right? I mean, we're given to giving so much credit to the fathers. And
exactly. And we
fathers, but it is really handed down. I mean, how powerful you can be. You see it, your mothers and your aunts and your grandmothers is whom you
absolutely
really take it from, and while they weren't and they were able to be strong at a time when they couldn't own their strength, so they subverted it in every which way.
Absolutely. And it's funny is that with the referencing grandmothers, is I dedicated this book to the memory of my own grandmother. She was born in the first year of World War I, and the story in the first chapter about the little girl who gets who gets lost trying to lay eggs for the starving children in Belgium is something that my grandmother actually wandered off into the chicken coop and was trying to lay eggs. And she was an amazingly strong woman. And I mean, if you speak to anybody who ever met her, she was a pistol. She was an absolute pistol, but she'd be the first one to say, oh, the best cooks in the world are men. If you complimented her cooking, so, oh, the best chefs in the world are men. She was the first person, despite the fact that she was the most fiercely independent person I had ever met, would be the first person to kind of divert the attention away from herself and give the credit to the men, because that was what she was socialized to do.
Absolutely.
Conditioned to do.
And so much of this book, I think, is the journey and the conditioning and discrimination, right? I mean,
absolutely.
One of my favorite things in the book was how people keep telling her, not all women can do this, but you can. And I think that kind of exceptionalism is almost something we see. It's at the heart of all discrimination and bigotry.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? Yes, you're Indian, but you speak good English. Like all the others, you're the one, or or anything, or you're the one, whatever, who's not like all the others that we for years can look down upon, right?
Exactly.
And so yes, all women are weak and and in need of protection, except you. You're the one who is different.
Don't think that you are like the status quo. You're exceptional. And in some ways, Ruby absolutely had to be exceptional. I mean, she had.
And while we've all had to do that, it's not. It's also a way to keep
the rest of everybody else in their proper place.
Yeah.
But I mean, she had access to a college education, which was not. I mean, it wasn't unheard of, certainly by 1917, but it was relatively rare. And the fact that her mother pushed her into French and ladylike subjects would have definitely been the norm, I think, back then. But these women that served, looking at their letters home and their correspondence, they were definitely subversive for the time. They were absolutely subversive.
Yeah, you had to be. I feel like in ways we still have to be. But back then it was, it was like 90% of if you wanted to do something, you had to please the people who would allow you to do it. And so you had to keep the peace if you wanted to kind of move the boulder. And so
exactly.
She does it fabulously, and she's not. This book is literally filled with exceptional women. You know, they're all, Evangeline is, like every single, Margot, all of them are exceptional.
Yeah,
So,
and the thing that I found interesting in doing the research was that the men loved these women. And I mean, if you were a woman in the U.S. Army Signal Corps and you were surrounded by a lot of unattached men, their dating opportunities galore. And it was so funny is that this is the era where you moved from courtship to dating. And you're reading Grace Banker's diary. She was completely oblivious to the fact that this dude that was coming and bringing her presents and things, she was completely oblivious to the fact he was in love with her. And it's just kind of a sign of the times. But the men welcomed these women. I mean, it took them 10 seconds to see how competent and accomplished these women were, how good they were at their jobs, and absolutely flawless. But the most kind of pushback that they saw was from the females who were serving as nurses.
So I did want to ask you about that, because you bring that up a few times.
Yes.
And while this book, I think, as on the whole, is very much women supporting women, and you make it a point to point out how, you know, women supported each other, and yet there was this between the nurses and the Signal Corps, there was this.
Yeah, there was a bit of a
friction.
rivalry
Yeah,
because
yeah.
the nurses had been the queen bees, I think, in every conflict since the dawn of man. And women simply didn't have an active role. I mean, we hear stories about the Civil War, women dressing up as men and pretending to be men and fighting and doing amazingly courageous things. But these were women going to war wearing skirts. I mean, these were women going to war as women and doing some really amazing things. And you had the yeomanettes and the marinettes serving in the Navy and the Marines. And for the first time, really in an official capacity. And so the nurses felt very much displaced. They were no longer, because that was the accepted cadre of women's position in war. And so there were, in the research I saw, oh my goodness, Grace Banker talking about, like, on the boat ride home, the nurses were just snooty to her. They wanted nothing to do with her. And when they would invite them over to their YMCA or a YWCA house, how, I kind of thought of Caroline Bingley coming to visit Eliza Bennett's older sister, Jane Bennett, in London, and just completely disinterested in their company. And that was kind of the relationship between the two groups. And honestly, and that has been a theme throughout women's history, is that, I mean, yes, men have traditionally wanted to keep women in their place, but women are the ones strapping each other into the corsets. And that's and kind of reinforcing those values because they want their daughters to be accepted and
right.
and what
so
women feel.
Yeah, I mean, I find it very hard to put the blame on women, because you've given through history, you're given such narrow avenues of power that you just, I mean, if you give me only like the whole mother-in-law daughter-in-law thing in the kitchen, that's your place that's the only place where you can exert power. And if you're giving all women one place to show their power,
exactly,
then they're going to do what you're doing in your workplace and on the battlefield and everywhere, in the arts, everywhere else.
Exactly.
You have these avenues where men are doing that to each other.
Yeah, and absolutely.
You focus it into this little thing with the women, and then say, oh, look at you women, you'll always keep each other down, and it's a lie.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that there is kind of this tension between the women who want to, or who feel like that is their only option, and the women who are subverting that, and the women who are traditionalists, so to speak, don't know how to deal with that necessarily. And that's kind of where I felt the nurses were coming from. It's like, what do you mean you're coming here and kind of taking my glory away? This is what women are meant to, this is how we serve our country in times of war. And there were hurt feelings, and I think that was a really interesting tidbit that I came across.
Really, and there's so many little tidbits like that, and which is why I think the research was made it like you were there. One of the things, and I think we might be running out of time, but I did want to talk about was the fact that these women came back from war and were not, and the army refused to accept them as their own.
Yeah, right? Exactly. They did not treat them as veterans. They had to take the oath of service, They were subject to court martial. They had to wear uniforms that they paid for, I mean, the equivalent of about $5,000 American, like modern dollars. It was over $300 to buy their kits because they were nice woolen uniforms and everything. And they went assuming that they were going to come back and have pensions and access to VA hospitals if they were ill, et cetera and so forth. And the country was overrun with injured veterans when they came back. The VA hospitals couldn't keep up with demand. And the government said, oh, sorry, you are actually civilian contractors and not, you're not, what's the word I'm looking for? You're not qualified, or you're not entitled to have these benefits. And there was kind of an ongoing legal battle to institute these women's veterans benefits, and they were picked up and dropped. Yeah, it was 1979. A young lawyer by the name of Mark Howe won the case for these women, and I got to meet him, which was like honestly the pinnacle of my research career ever. I feel like I will never get to relive that type of experience, but I got to sit down and talk with him and listen to him get interviewed about his experience meeting with the last of these women. But there were like a tenth of them left by the time they won the veterans benefits, and they got their veterans medals, they got their pensions, and it was in some ways kind of a hollow victory. But these women came back from war, and they started families, and they went back. Everybody wanted to go back to life the way it was, and a lot of them didn't have interest in taking on the U.S. government in court. But there was one woman by the name of Merle Egan from Montana, and by golly, she was not going to let the Army get away with it. And she actually passed away before she actually even got her check, I think. But she got her veterans medal and everything, and she said, I've won my victory against the U.S. Army, finally. And it's just heartbreaking to think of the years that these women, the women who came back ill or injured, because, I mean, there was Spanish flu and other things that happened. Some of these women did come back injured and weren't able to get help in a VA hospital, which is terrible.
And what, 229 women, and 29 were alive when the case was went.
Yeah, roughly.
That just wrenched me. I mean, I think I couldn't sleep all night. It was just to think that that had happened to them. But good for him. How was he related to? What was his cause?
I think that I don't know exactly how he got involved, but Merle reached out to him, and he was working in a law firm that allowed him to spend some hours working on the case. And he was a young new lawyer at the time, and he put together an airtight case. And when he finally won the case, he physically drove all of the paraphernalia that these women had sent to him, the uniforms, the affidavits, the correspondence, all of their sick leave records, the whole thing. He carted it up in his car and drove it to Kansas City to the World War I Museum, because he did not trust, he's like, the United States government had let these women down, and I'm not going to trust the Postal Service to do it another time. And so, yeah, it's just an amazing story, and he cared so much about these women and their legacy.
Wow, and then also there's that little nuance in there where they made them take the oath, and it was almost like grandstanding to kind of convince them that it was almost like theater, right? He says as much, right? That, that was only so to make sure you took it seriously, right? So there's this,
absolutely.
again, treating women like children. It's like,
exactly.
let's give you something to make you feel like you're at war. Excuse me, I'm in a trench,
exactly.
And I'm kind of, my friends are dying of smoke inhalation from the bombs, and you need to trick me into thinking I'm It's an amazing story. And also the whole what's cutting edge technology. It's a word we use so much, and now cutting edge technology becomes not cutting edge in like 7 seconds.
And it was far more durable because it took so long to put together an infrastructure.
Right, but at that time this was absolutely, like, they were actually on the edge of this cutting edge technology.
Yeah, and the phone was invented in what I think I said 1850. It was 1876, the year where the phone was invented, and it wasn't even commonplace by 1917. Not really, really commonplace.
Wow.
But it was becoming that way. But.
Yeah, and the automobile, where where the mom says, I mean, if you want to get into those death traps, it's on
exactly.
you. I'm not.
Yeah, that was kind of an image that I put in the book, is that fewer and fewer horses, more and more automobiles.
Wow, yeah. No, it's just such a lovely slice
Oh,
of
thank you.
history and time. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about the love story, which is really, really lovely. Um, just so heartwarming, and also again so much about her agency, because she's engaged when she meets
Andrew.
Andrew in wartime, and I just love how he works that whole situation, and how she realizes the difference between being betrothed to somebody for duty and her own desire, and female sexual agency kind of comes into it, and I just loved that.
Well, and the interesting thing was when I was pitching this book to Lake Union, one of the questions about it was my first conversation I ever had with my new editor, and he said, "Is there going to be a love interest?" And I said, "Well, they were pretty busy. I don't know. I just don't know." And then I thought about it, and love doesn't take a break for war. It simply doesn't. In fact, it kind of creates a sense of urgency and a sense of our own mortality. And when she was perfectly content to marry Nathaniel, and had the war never happened, she would have married Nathaniel, been reasonably happy, and she would have compromised enough with herself to be happy, and she would have had a passel of kids and been a decent society wife. But Nathaniel represented the mores of the old world, the pre-war world, and Andrew represented everything, the promise of the progressive new world. He was the boy that came from an Irish immigrant father, an Italian immigrant mother, who had a penchant for opera but wanted to be a doctor, and was given a scrap of a chance by a local family doctor who saw a spark of brilliance in the kid. And he was kind of the American ideal, the American dream.
He is, yes.
All he needed was a couple of bucks and a chance to be able to make something of himself. And it was so in a sense, the love triangle and the whole love story is really just a metaphor for the changing values that happened in the Western world at that time.
Yeah, and I think that pretty much is the whole book. It's such a lovely slice of that time, and basically change. It just completely highlights, spotlights a changing world beautifully. So thank you so much. Great job. All right, so we are at the end of our time.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been lovely.
Thanks so much for being here. Don't believe that was a half hour, but I'm told it was half hour. So I'm going to have to take our viewers out. Thank you so much for being here. Again, this was Aimee Runyan with Girls on the Line. It is absolutely fabulous. You will know so much more about our world after you've read it. So $14.95. You can order a signed copy from authorsvoice.net. Thank you so much for tuning in. And I am going to take you out with upcoming shows. I think the next Lit with Love in January will be with Kate Meader. So come back for that. Kate's books are funny and hot and absolutely fabulous. All right, the other authors coming up on Author's Voice are: on A House Divided, author Timothy B. Smith will speak to host Bjorn Skaptason about his latest history books, The Real Horse Soldiers and The Decision Was Always My Own. That's December 6th at 3:30. On A House Divided, the award-winning historian Sean Willens will appear December 13th at 3:30 p.m. to talk about No Property in Man. On Ladybird and Friends, author Adam Schmidt joins Betsy Bird to discuss Speechless. That's December 14th at 5:30 p.m. If you are watching this on YouTube, remember to order signed copies from authorsvoice.net. Thank you so much for being here, Aimee. It was such a pleasure, and thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.